Sometimes a man's last $300 can buy him more than shelter. It can buy him a second chance. Dalton had nothing left but debt and regret when he bought that broken desert cabin. The roof rattled, the walls leaked sand, and it looked ready to fall apart. But it was his. Inside, while sweeping the dusty floors, his foot hit something hollow. He pulled up the boards and found a metal box buried beneath. Inside were old journals, maps, and photographs of green land where only desert existed now. The pages told of a forgotten well under the cabin that once brought water to life. Dalton knelt there, hands shaking. Could this worthless land be saved? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to the desert had taken Dalton 3 days. 3 days of watching the landscape change from green to brown to nothing at all. 3 days to think about everything he'd lost and everything he was running from. The business that collapsed, the marriage that followed, the lawyers, the creditors, the sympathetic looks from people who used to respect him. He'd found the listing online at 2 in the morning, sitting in a motel room he could barely afford. Historic desert property, fixer-upper, $300 or best offer. The photograph showed a structure that barely qualified as a building, more like 4 walls and a prayer holding up a rusted tin roof. But $300 was exactly what he had left after selling everything that mattered. The realtor had been apologetic. I'm legally required to tell you there's no running water, no electricity, and the nearest town is 15 miles away. Are you sure about this? Dalton had been sure, or at least he'd been out of options, which felt like the same thing. Now, kneeling on the dusty floorboards with that metal box open in front of him, he wondered if desperation had bought him something more than a place to hide. The box was old, the kind of old that came with weight and purpose. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at his touch, were 3 leather-bound journals, a collection of maps drawn on yellowed paper, and a stack of photographs that showed something impossible. The photographs showed water. Not just water, but fields of green stretching across land that now looked like the surface of Mars. Families stood in front of wooden houses with real gardens. Children played near what looked like a stream. The images were dated 1891, 1893, 1899, written in careful script on the backs. Dalton picked up the first journal. The leather cover was cracked but intact, and the pages inside were filled with tight, measured handwriting. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1891. "My name is Virgil Crane," it began. "I'm setting this down so that those who come after will know what we built here, and why it matters." Dalton sat back against the wall and began to read. Virgil Crane had come west with his wife and 2 others, looking for land that could sustain a life. They'd found this spot because of the cottonwood trees, 3 of them, long dead now, that had indicated water beneath the surface. Virgil had been a mining engineer before becoming a homesteader, and he'd known how to read the land. "We dug for 6 weeks, the journal read, down through sand and clay and limestone. At 190 feet, we struck the aquifer. The water came up cold and clear and tasted like forgiveness. The well had supported not just Virgil's family, but a small community that grew around it." The photograph showed the evidence, a dozen families, maybe more, all thriving in the middle of nowhere because one man had known where to dig. Dalton turned the pages carefully, reading by the last light coming through the broken shutters. The entries spanned years. Birth announcements, harvest reports, records of marriages and new homes built. Virgil Crane had documented everything with the precision of a man who understood he was building something that mattered. Then, the tone changed. An entry from 1905, Horace has been talking to men from the railroad. "I told him it was a mistake, but he won't listen. He believes they'll bring prosperity. I believe they'll bring trouble." More entries followed, darker and more worried. The railroad wanted the water rights. They were offering money, making promises, applying pressure. Horace, Virgil's partner in the original claim, was listening. July 3rd, 1907, Dalton read. "It's done. Horace sold the information about our water source to the railroad surveyors. They filed competing claims on the aquifer rights. The lawyers say we'll lose everything unless we can prove prior beneficial use, but Horace has given them our drilling logs. He says the railroad promised him work, promised him a future. All I see is betrayal. The final entries were brief and bitter. September 1907. We've lost. The judge ruled in favor of the railroad. They say we can buy water from them at their rates, or we can leave. Most are leaving. October 1907, I've sealed the well. If we cannot have the water we found, we fought for, and built our lives around, then neither will those who stole it. I've made it so only someone with knowledge and determination can reach it again. Let it wait for honest folk who will use it right. Let it wait for better days. There was a map tucked between the last pages, hand-drawn, meticulous, showing the exact location of the well shaft. It ran directly beneath where Dalton was sitting. He stood up slowly, looking at the floorboards beneath his feet. The cabin had been built over the well site. Virgil must have constructed it as a marker, a guardian for what lay below. Dalton walked outside. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. The wind moved across the empty land, stirring up dust devils that danced and disappeared. 15 miles to the north, he could see a faint suggestion of lights. Dust Haven, the realtor had called it. A town barely hanging on, surviving on trucked-in water and stubborn pride. He'd passed through it on his way here. One main street. A hardware store that looked like it predated statehood. A diner with a closed sign that seemed permanent. Maybe 100 people total. Most of them looking like they'd stayed past the point where leaving made sense. If the well could be reopened, if the water still flowed after more than a century, Dalton stopped himself. That kind of thinking had gotten him in trouble before. Grand plans, big ideas, dreams that looked solid until they collapsed under the weight of reality. But this was different. This wasn't a business scheme or a calculated risk. This was water in the desert. This was something real, something that had existed before and could exist again. He went back inside and lit the camping lantern he'd brought. The cabin looked worse in the light. Water-stained walls, holes in the roof, sand drifted into every corner. But it had good bones. The frame was solid lumber, probably hauled in at great expense a century ago. The foundation stones were carefully placed. Someone had built this to last. Dalton pulled out the maps again and studied them by lantern light. The well shaft went down 200 feet. Virgil had sealed it with what he called a mechanical lock, some kind of system that could be opened with the right knowledge, but would resist brute force. Smart man, Virgil Crane. He'd known that anger and desperation would pass, but the land would remain. The question was whether Dalton had the knowledge, the determination, and the sheer foolish courage to try reaching it. He looked around the cabin, his cabin, bought for his last $300. Outside, the desert stretched in every direction, hostile and empty. But beneath his feet, if Virgil Crane's journals were true, lay enough water to bring it all back to life. Dalton had come here to hide from his failures. Now he wondered if he'd stumbled into something that could redeem them. He pulled out a notebook from his pack and began to write, making lists and plans. First, he needed to understand the cabin's structure. Second, he needed supplies. Third, he needed to know if anyone in Dust Haven remembered the old stories, the old wells, the days when this desert had been something more. The lantern burned low as he worked. Outside, the temperature dropped sharply the way it does in the desert, and Dalton wrapped himself in his sleeping bag without stopping. His hand moved across the page, planning and calculating, while Virgil Crane's journals lay open beside him like a promise from the past. Tomorrow, he would go to Dust Haven. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of finding out if a man's last $300 could buy not just shelter, but hope. The drive to Dust Haven took 20 minutes on a road that fought against the idea of pavement. Dalton's truck rattled over washboard sections and dodged potholes that looked deep enough to swallow a tire. When he finally rolled onto what passed for Main Street, the town looked even more depleted in daylight than it had at dusk. The hardware store sat at the corner where the highway intersected with the town's only other road. Sutton's Supply was painted on a wooden sign that had faded to ghost letters. Dalton parked and went inside, grateful for the shade if nothing else. The store smelled like motor oil and old wood. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the kind of basics that people forgot they needed until they needed them. Nails, rope, work gloves, lamp oil. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper with the focused attention of someone who had already memorized every word. "Help you?" he asked without looking up. "I'm looking for excavation supplies," Dalton said. "Shovels, pickaxes, safety rope, and information, if you're selling that too." The man set down his newspaper and looked at Dalton with eyes that had seen too many strangers come through with ideas. "Sutton," he said, not offering his hand. "What kind of information?" "I bought the old Crane property. The cabin about 15 miles south." Sutton's expression shifted from neutral to something closer to concern. "That place. What'd you pay for it?" $300. "Then you overpaid." Sutton stood up and walked to where the tools hung on the wall. He selected a sturdy shovel and a pickaxe with a hickory handle. "These'll do for whatever fool thing you're planning. Rope's over there. You want my advice?" "Depends on if I have to pay for it. It's free, which should tell you what it's worth." Sutton set the tools on the counter. "Leave that land alone. Nothing good has come from it in 100 years, and nothing good will come from it now." Dalton pulled out Virgil Crane's map and unfolded it on the counter. "You know anything about this?" Sutton stared at the map for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. "Where did you find that?" "In a metal box under the floorboards. There were journals, too. Written by Virgil Crane." "I'll be damned." Sutton traced a finger along the map's markings. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the old well. Said it was the reason this town exists at all. Before the railroad came and before the water wars, this was green country. Hard to believe now. The journals say the well was sealed. They say it's still down there. The journals also ought to tell you why it was sealed and what happened to the last fool who tried to reach it." Sutton looked up at Dalton. "That was 1952. Man named Bernard Thorne, my uncle. He thought he could open the well, thought he could bring the water back. They found him at the bottom of the shaft 3 days after he went down, crushed by a cave-in." The bell above the door chimed. A woman in her 40s entered, carrying a leather satchel and wearing boots that had actually seen desert work. She had the kind of face that suggested she spent more time outdoors than in, with sun lines around her eyes and no-nonsense efficiency in her movements. "Sutton, I need rock samples analyzed." She stopped when she saw the map on the counter. "Is that what I think it is?" "Iris, meet the new owner of the Crane place," Sutton said. "He's about to get himself killed trying to dig up ghosts." Iris moved closer, studying the map with immediate intensity. "May I?" She didn't wait for permission before pulling a magnifier from her satchel and examining the details. "This is original surveyor's notation. 1890s by the look of it. Where exactly did you find this?" Dalton explained about the box, the journals, and what he'd learned about the sealed well. Iris listened without interrupting, her focus absolute. "I'm a geologist," she said when he finished. "I've been studying the water table in this region for 2 years. According to modern surveys, there's an aquifer system running beneath this entire valley, but we haven't been able to pinpoint reliable access points." "If this map is accurate—" "It's not accurate," Sutton cut in. "It's a death sentence. Tell him, Iris. Tell him what happens when you go digging in unstable desert foundations." "What happens is sometimes you find exactly what you're looking for," Iris said. She looked at Dalton directly. "I won't pretend this isn't dangerous, but if that well still exists, if the seal can be opened safely, we're talking about a water source that could serve this entire region. Do you understand what that means?" Dalton understood. He'd seen the dying farms on the drive-in, the empty houses, the for sale signs that had weathered to the point of illegibility. Water meant survival. Water meant people could stay instead of leaving. Water meant the difference between a ghost town and a community. "I'm going to try," he said. Sutton shook his head slowly. "Then you're going to need more than rope and a shovel." You're going to need support beams, safety equipment, and someone watching from above in case things go wrong. You're also going to need a miracle, but I can't sell those. I can provide the geological expertise, Iris said. I'd want to document everything, map the excavation, and take samples. This could be significant research. I don't want fame, Dalton said. I just want water. Then we have different motivations, but the same goal. Iris extended her hand. If you're serious about this, I'd like to help. Dalton shook her hand, then turned back to Sutton. Ring up the tools, and anything else you think I'll need. Sutton worked the register with the air of a man enabling a mistake. Safety harness, headlamp, first aid kit that's actually stocked. And you take my number. You check in every evening. If I don't hear from you, I'm calling what passes for law enforcement out here. Deal. As Sutton bagged the supplies, Iris spread the map wider, taking photographs with a professional camera. The seal is marked here, she said, pointing. 200 feet down. The way it's drawn suggests a mechanical system, rather than just collapsed rubble. That's both good and bad. How so? Good because it means the shaft itself might still be intact. Bad because mechanical systems fail. After 118 years, we have no idea what condition it's in. Dalton paid for the supplies and loaded them into his truck. Iris followed him outside, still studying her photographs. I'll come by tomorrow, she said. I want to see the cabin's foundation, assess the structural integrity. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Why are you really interested in this? Dalton asked. Iris smiled slightly. Because I left a tenured position at a university after someone stole my research and published it under their name. I came out here to start over, to find something that mattered more than academic politics. Maybe this is it. She walked to her jeep, then turned back. Sutton's right to be worried, you know. But he's also wrong. Sometimes the only way forward is down. Dalton drove back to the cabin with a truck bed full of tools and a head full of plans. The map sat on the passenger seat, its lines and markings promising something that seemed impossible. But impossible had never stopped him before. It had only broken him. This time, he thought, would be different. This time, he had nothing left to lose, which meant he was finally free to try. The cabin waited in the afternoon heat, small and stubborn against the empty horizon. Dalton unloaded the supplies and carried them inside. He stood in the center of the room and stomped on the floorboards, listening for the hollow sound that would tell him where to start. When he found it, a section that echoed differently from the rest, he knelt down and marked it with chalk. Tomorrow he would begin. Tomorrow he would start the work of reaching down through sand and stone and time to find what Virgil Crane had left behind. Tonight, he read the journals again by lantern light, paying attention to every detail Virgil had recorded about the well's construction. The man had been thorough, had documented everything with the care of someone who knew his work would matter to people he'd never meet. Dalton understood that feeling now. He was doing this for himself, yes, but also for Sutton and Iris and everyone else in Dust Haven who deserved better than slow death by drought. He was doing it because sometimes a man needed to believe that what was broken could be fixed, that what was lost could be found, and that the past held answers the present desperately needed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof the way it had since he'd arrived. But now the sound felt different. Now it sounded like the beginning of something rather than the end. The first swing of the pickaxe came at dawn, when the desert was still cool enough to breathe. Dalton had pulled up the floorboards the night before, exposing packed earth that had been undisturbed for longer than he'd been alive. Now he stood over the spot, tools arranged beside him, and began the work of going down. The earth gave way reluctantly. Sand and clay mixed together in layers that told geological stories he couldn't read. He worked in careful increments, digging a square shaft wide enough for his shoulders, but narrow enough to brace against the walls. Every bucket of dirt he hauled up was dirt that wouldn't bury him if things went wrong. By midday, he'd gone down 4 feet. His hands were already blistering despite the work gloves, and his shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. He climbed out, drank water that tasted like plastic from the jug, and looked at what he'd accomplished. 4 feet, 196 to go. The mathematics of it felt crushing. At this rate, it would take weeks, maybe months. And that was assuming the shaft didn't collapse, didn't flood, didn't reveal some geological impossibility that made the whole thing pointless. He went back down anyway. The work had a rhythm to it that felt almost meditative. Swing, strike, scoop, lift. Swing, strike, scoop, lift. His mind drifted while his body labored, traveling back through the years to the office he used to own. The employees he'd had to let go one by one. The meetings with lawyers where words like bankruptcy and liquidation became his new vocabulary. He'd been good at what he did, commercial construction consulting. He'd built a business on knowing how to read blueprints and catch problems before they became catastrophes. But then the economy shifted. Contracts dried up, and the loans he'd taken to expand came due all at once. He'd tried to save it, had worked 100-hour weeks, had sold his car, and then his house, and then everything else that had value. It hadn't been enough. His wife had stayed through most of it, had believed in him longer than he'd deserved. But there's only so much failure a marriage can survive. She'd left quietly, taking the furniture and the shared photo albums and the future they'd planned together. No drama, no shouting. Just a conversation where she'd said she couldn't watch him drown anymore. The pickaxe struck something that rang metallic. Dalton stopped, his reverie shattered. He was 12 feet down now, had been working for 3 days straight. The sun was setting again, painting the walls of his shaft in orange light. He knelt and brushed away dirt carefully, his blistered hands suddenly gentle. It was a tool. A pickaxe like his own, but older, the wooden handle dark with age and soil. He worked it free carefully, knowing somehow that this mattered, that this was more than just a forgotten tool. The handle had initials carved into it. B.T. Bernard Thorne, Sutton's uncle. The last man who'd tried this. Dalton climbed out of the shaft and sat with the pickaxe across his knees as the light failed. The wood was still solid despite decades underground. Someone had cared for this tool, had used it with the intention of finishing what they started. Bernard Thorne had come down here with hope and determination and had died for it. The weight of that settled over Dalton like the cooling desert air. He was following in the literal footsteps of a dead man, digging in the same earth, chasing the same dream. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it steadied him. Bernard Thorne had tried alone. Dalton had Iris's expertise, Sutton's reluctant support, and a century's worth of additional knowledge about excavation safety. He also had nothing to lose. Bernard Thorne had probably had a family, a life, people depending on him. Dalton's dependencies had all been resolved through divorce papers and bankruptcy court. There was a freedom in that, dark as it was. The next morning, Sutton arrived with his truck loaded with lumber. He climbed out slowly, looking at the pile of excavated dirt beside the cabin, then at Dalton. "You're actually doing this," he said. "I'm actually doing this." Sutton walked over to where the pickaxe lay beside the shaft. He picked it up, ran his hand along the handle, and his face went carefully blank. This was Bernard's. He carved those initials the day he started digging. Said if he was going to die doing something stupid, he wanted his name on the tools. "I'm sorry," Dalton said. "Don't be sorry. Be smarter than he was." Sutton set the pickaxe down with care that bordered on reverence. He went down alone. No safety line, no support structure, just faith and stubbornness. When part of the shaft collapsed, there was no one to pull him out. We found him 3 days later. How old were you? 16. Old enough to help dig him out? Old enough to remember? Sutton gestured to the lumber in his truck. "I brought support beams. You're going to install one every 6 feet as you go down. And you're going to use a safety harness tied to that cottonwood stump. And you're going to check in with me every single evening. You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." "I couldn't stop Bernard. Maybe I can stop you from ending up the same way." Sutton started unloading 2x6s. "Besides, if you actually find water down there, this town needs it. We've been dying slowly for 50 years. Maybe it's time we tried living instead." They spent the morning building a frame over the shaft and installing the first set of support beams. Sutton worked with the efficiency of someone who'd been solving practical problems his entire life. He didn't talk much, but his hands were steady and his measurements were exact. Iris arrived at noon with equipment that looked expensive and scientific. She spent an hour taking measurements, running some kind of ground-penetrating survey, and making notes in a field journal that was already half filled with data. "The shaft is stable so far," she reported. "The soil composition is mostly clay and caliche, which means it should hold if you support it properly. But once you hit 20 feet, you'll be into a sandstone layer. That's where it gets dangerous." "How dangerous?" "The kind of dangerous where the walls can collapse without warning if you disturb the wrong grain of sand." She showed him her survey results. "But look here. There's a void space at approximately 180 feet. That matches Virgil Crane's journal entries about the depth of the sealed chamber." "It's actually there, Dalton." "The well is real." The three of them stood looking at the shaft, each processing that information differently. Sutton saw vindication of old stories and old grief. Iris saw scientific confirmation and research possibilities. Dalton saw 180 feet of uncertainty between him and redemption. "I'm going back down," he said. He worked through the afternoon, installing supports as he went, following Sutton's instructions exactly. The safety harness felt awkward at first, but became reassuring. Every 6 feet he'd stop and set new beams, creating a ladder of stability down into the dark. At 18 feet, his shovel struck something that wasn't earth. He cleared around it carefully and found wood, old timber, partially rotted, that had once been part of a structure. Bernard Thorne's failed attempt at support beaming, probably. Dalton worked around it, leaving the old wood in place where it was still solid, replacing it where it had deteriorated. The desert sun hammered down into the shaft, and sweat ran into his eyes despite the bandana he wore. His hands were beyond blistered now, were raw and bleeding through the gloves. But he kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering all the times he'd failed before. This time would be different. This time he was building something that mattered more than profit margins and quarterly reports. He was building toward water in a land that desperately needed it. He was building toward proof that broken things could be fixed, that sealed things could be opened, that a man's last $300 could buy more than shelter. When Iris called down that it was getting dark, Dalton climbed out to find Sutton had stayed the entire day. The older man had built a proper staging area with platforms for tools and buckets, had rigged a pulley system to make hauling dirt easier, and had set up a camping stove with coffee brewing. 20 feet, Sutton said, handing him a cup. "That's good progress." "Dangerous progress, but good." Dalton sipped the coffee and looked at Bernard's pickaxe, still lying where Sutton had set it that morning. "I'll be more careful than he was." "You'd better be. I'm too old to dig out another body." But Sutton's voice carried something that might have been hope underneath the gruffness. "Come by the store tomorrow. I'll have more supplies ready, and actual food. You can't live on stubbornness alone." After they left, Dalton sat at the edge of his shaft and wrote in his own notebook, documenting the day's progress. 20 feet down, evidence of Bernard Thorne's attempt. First solid proof that the well existed. He wrote it all down the way Virgil Crane had, creating a record for whoever might come after. Then he lay in his sleeping bag and looked up at stars that seemed impossibly bright without city lights to dim them. Somewhere below, through 160 feet of sand and stone, was water. He just had to be smart enough, careful enough, and stubborn enough to reach it. The pickaxe lay beside him as he fell asleep, its carved initials visible in the starlight. BT, a man who'd tried and died trying. Dalton closed his eyes and promised himself he'd finish what Bernard Thorne had started. Not just for himself, but for everyone who'd believed the water was real and worth dying for. Tomorrow he'd go deeper. Tomorrow he'd keep building toward that sealed chamber. Tomorrow, and every tomorrow after, until he either found water or found his own limit. The desert wind sang through the cabin's broken walls, and somewhere far below, if Virgil Crane had been right, water waited in the dark, 3 weeks into the excavation. Dalton was 78 feet down and moving through sandstone that fractured if he breathed too hard. The shaft had become its own world, cool and dark and separate from everything above. Time moved differently down here. Minutes stretched, hours compressed. The only constants were the rhythm of his work and the growing ache in his muscles. He'd learned to read the rock, to feel which sections would hold and which wanted to crumble. It was similar to his old work, reading blueprints and understanding structural integrity, except now the consequences of a wrong guess weren't financial, they were final. He was clearing a particularly stubborn section when his pickaxe struck metal again. The sound rang through the shaft, clear and unmistakable. Dalton stopped, his breath suddenly loud in the confined space. He cleared around the object carefully, and in the beam of his headlamp, brass gleamed. It took 20 minutes to work it free. When he finally held it in his hands, he understood he'd found something significant. The device was about the size of a shoebox, made of brass that had tarnished green but remained solid. It had lenses on one end, angle measurements engraved on its side, and a level bubble perfectly preserved in glass. A surveyor's transit. Professional equipment from another era. Dalton secured it in a bucket and hauled it up. By the time he climbed out, Iris's Jeep was pulling up to the cabin. She'd been coming by most afternoons, documenting his progress and taking measurements. Their partnership had settled into comfortable efficiency. She provided technical knowledge. He provided the physical labor that knowledge required. "I found something," he called out. Iris approached quickly, saw the transit, and went very still. "May I?" She handled it like it was sacred, turning it over, examining the engravings, testing the mechanisms. "This is a girly transit. 1880s manufacturing. Do you know what this means? That someone was very careful about measurements? That someone was a professional surveyor. This isn't homesteader equipment, Dalton. This is what you'd use for legal boundaries, for official claims, for work that had to hold up in court." She looked up from the device. Virgil Crane must have used this to establish the well's exact location and the property boundaries. With this, we could recreate his original surveys. Why would that matter now? Because property law is built on survey precision. If we can prove Virgil's original surveys were accurate, it strengthens any claim to water rights based on historical use. She was already pulling out her camera, photographing the transit from every angle. This is documentation, Dalton. This is proof that what Virgil built was real and legal and recorded properly. She spent the next hour with the transit, measuring angles and taking readings. Dalton watched her work with the focused intensity of someone who'd found her purpose. He recognized it because he was starting to feel the same thing, the sense that this mattered beyond personal redemption. "Tell me why you really left the university," he said during a break. Iris set down her notebook and looked out at the desert. "I spent 6 years researching sustainable water management in arid environments. Original work, new approaches, everything documented and peer-reviewed at every stage. My department head took my research, presented it as his own at a conference, and published under his name. When I objected, I was told I should be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to important work. What did you do?" "I quit, walked out the same day." She smiled without humor. "Everyone said I was throwing away my career over ego. But it wasn't ego. It was principle. I'd done the work. I'd earned the recognition, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, just to maintain professional courtesy. So you came here. I came here because I wanted to do work that mattered more than academic politics. I wanted to find something real that no one could steal or diminish or take credit for. And then you showed up with Virgil Crane's journals and a death wish." She looked at him directly. "You're not the only one trying to prove something, Dalton." That evening, they used the transit to map the property boundaries based on Virgil's original surveys. The work was painstaking, requiring multiple readings and careful calculations. But when they finished, the results were clear. The well shaft was exactly where Virgil had documented it, and the property lines Dalton had purchased matched the historical claim. Your $300 bought you legitimate ownership of a documented water source. Iris said. If we reach the well, if the water still flows, you have legal claim to it based on prior beneficial use and continuous property ownership. Even after 118 years, water rights in the West are complicated, but prior appropriation usually holds. First in time, first in right. Virgil was here first, established beneficial use, and the property has remained continuously owned, even if the well was sealed. It's a strong position. Dalton looked at the transit sitting on the makeshift table Sutton had built. A tool from the past, still functional, still proving its worth. Like the well itself, waiting beneath layers of time and earth. I need to tell you something, Iris said. I've been running computer models based on the geological surveys. The aquifer system under this land is extensive. If the well is opened, it won't just provide water for your property. It could supply the entire Dusthaven region. How much water? Enough to transform everything. Enough to bring agriculture back, to support a real community, to reverse 50 years of decline. She paused. Enough to make this land extremely valuable to the right buyer. I'm not selling. I believe you. But once word gets out that you're close to reaching a major water source, you'll have interested parties. Development companies, agricultural corporations, people who see profit where you see redemption. She met his eyes. You need to think about what happens when you succeed. That night, Dalton couldn't sleep. He lay in the cabin and thought about what Iris had said. He'd been so focused on the excavation itself that he hadn't considered the implications of success. In his mind, he'd been chasing personal redemption, proof that he could finish something, that he could succeed at something that mattered. But if the water was as significant as Iris suggested, this wasn't about him anymore. This was about everyone in Dusthaven who'd stayed when leaving made more sense. About Sutton keeping his store open, despite having no customers. About families trying to raise children in a dying town because it was home. He thought about his ex-wife and the conversation where she'd said she couldn't watch him drown. What if this was different? What if instead of drowning, he was diving, going down into the dark not to escape, but to find something worth bringing back up? The transit sat on the table, its brass surface catching moonlight through the broken shutters. Tools lasted if they were built well and used right. Virgil Crane had built something that lasted. Bernard Thorne had died trying to prove it. Now Dalton was following that line of intention down into the earth, adding his effort to theirs. He got up and went to the shaft, 78 feet down, 102 feet to go. The pulley system Sutton had rigged creaked in the night breeze. The support beams descended into darkness in neat 6-foot intervals, a ladder of safety that Dalton himself had built. He'd spent his career reading blueprints and understanding structures. Now he was building one of the most important structures of his life, a path down to water that could save a community. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd failed at commercial construction consulting, but might succeed at something infinitely more fundamental. Tomorrow he'd go down again. Tomorrow he'd work through more sandstone and clay. Tomorrow, he'd get closer to that sealed chamber where Virgil Crane's mechanical lock waited to be opened. But tonight, he allowed himself to imagine success. Water flowing again after more than a century. The desert greening around his cabin. Dusthaven becoming something more than a stubborn collection of holdouts. And himself, transformed from a man running from failure into someone who'd built something that mattered. The stars turned overhead and the desert breathed its dry breath. And somewhere far below, water waited in the dark for hands and will and brass instruments that could find it again. Dalton picked up the transit and carried it inside. He set it beside Virgil Crane's journals and Bernard Thorne's pickaxe, tools from the past that illuminated the future. Then he lay down and slept better than he had in months, dreaming of water rising through stone, of green spreading across sand, of redemption measured in depth and determination. The excavation would continue. The well would be reached, and when it was, everything would change. He believed that now, with a certainty that felt like faith, earned one painful foot at a time, built on the foundation of those who'd tried before him and those who supported him now. 78 feet down. 102 to go. The mathematics no longer felt crushing. They felt like a promise. At 80 feet down, Dalton's pickaxe struck glass. He stopped immediately, his heart hammering. Glass didn't belong in a sealed shaft. He cleared around it with his hands, brushing away sand grain by grain until he could see what he'd found. A bottle, dark green glass, sealed with wax that had somehow survived more than a century underground. Inside, he could see paper, folded carefully, protected from time and moisture by its glass prison. He secured it in the bucket and hauled it up, then climbed out into afternoon light that felt too bright after hours in the shaft. His hands were shaking as he examined the bottle. There was writing etched into the glass itself. For whoever finds this. Iris arrived as he was working the wax seal free. She watched in silence as he carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was Virgil Crane's, unmistakable from the journals. May 15th, 1907, Dalton read aloud. To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, you have done what I could not. You have reached this depth with intention and care. You deserve to know the truth of why I sealed this well and what you will find if you continue. The letter explained what the journals had only hinted at. The water rights war hadn't been a simple dispute. The railroad company had wanted to control all water access in the region, to force homesteaders to sell their land cheap or abandon it entirely. They'd used legal tricks, surveying fraud and intimidation. My partner Horace Aldrich sold us out, the letter continued. He gave them our drilling logs, our maps, our measurements. He did it for money and promises of position. The railroad used that information to file competing claims, saying they'd discovered the water first. They had lawyers and influence. We had only truth, and truth lost in their courtroom. Dalton paused, the name registering. Aldrich, is that a common name around here? Iris frowned. There's a developer named Percy Aldrich, who's been buying properties in the region. I've seen his name on land records. Could be a coincidence. Could be, Iris said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Dalton continued reading. I sealed this well not out of spite, but out of hope. I could not let the railroad have it. They would have used it to enslave every farmer in this valley. Better it remain hidden until honest folk could use it right. I designed the seal to be opened by someone with knowledge and determination, someone who would value water for what it truly means. Life itself, not profit. The letter included technical details about the mechanical seal, how it worked, what tools would be needed, and warnings about the delicate balance of pressures at that depth. Virgil had thought of everything, had planned for someone like Dalton to come along decades or even centuries later. He was protecting it, Iris said softly, not just sealing it, but preserving it for us. The letter ended with coordinates and a final message. The water belongs to those who stay and build. Remember that when you bring it back to the surface. Remember that some things matter more than money. That evening, word of the discovery spread through Dust Haven. Dalton hadn't told anyone beyond Iris and Sutton, but news traveled fast in small towns. By sunset, 3 pickups were parked near his cabin, and a dozen people stood around his excavation site, looking down into the shaft like it was a prophet's well. An older woman introduced herself as Beverly Chen, one of the few remaining original families. My grandparents homesteaded here in the 1920s. They always talked about the old well, said if it could be found, the valley could live again. A younger man, maybe 40, extended a calloused hand. Trent Ashwood. I'm trying to keep my family's farm going, but we're down to trucked water that costs more than what we can grow. If you really find water down there. He didn't finish the sentence, but the desperation in his voice finished it for him. Others came forward with similar stories. Families holding on to land their grandparents had settled. Small businesses barely surviving. Children growing up in a dying town because their parents refused to give up. Each person represented years of stubborn hope, and now they were looking at Dalton like he might be the answer. The pressure of it settled over him like the weight of 80 feet of earth. As the crowd dispersed, a new vehicle arrived, a black SUV too clean for desert roads. A man in his 50s stepped out, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt that screamed corporate casual. He walked like he owned everything he looked at. "Dalton Harper," he said, extending his hand. "Percy Aldrich, I own most of the commercial properties in Dust Haven and several thousand acres of surrounding land. I'd like to talk to you about your excavation project." Dalton didn't shake his hand. "How do you know my name? Small town, news travels." Aldrich smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I understand you found something interesting down there. Historical documents, evidence of an old water source. That's valuable information." "Not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Mr. Harper. It's just a matter of price." Aldrich pulled out a business card. "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for your property and all rights to whatever you find below it. That's a substantial return on a $300 investment. And what would you do with the water? Develop the region properly, bring in real investment, create jobs, build infrastructure, turn Dust Haven from a dying town into a thriving community." Aldrich gestured at the desert around them. "These people are clinging to a past that's gone. I'm offering them a future. By buying up their land when they can't afford to stay." Aldrich's smile thinned. "I buy property that's for sale. If people choose to sell rather than watch their investments crumble, that's business. But with a confirmed water source, everything changes. I could develop this into a resort community, a retirement destination, real prosperity, not subsistence farming." "No," Dalton said. "You should think carefully before refusing. Legal challenges to old property claims can be expensive. Surveying, disputes, water rights litigation, environmental impact studies, these things take years and cost money you don't have." Aldrich placed his card on the excavation frame. "My offer's good for 48 hours. After that, things get complicated." He drove away, leaving a dust trail that hung in the still air long after the sound of his engine faded. Sutton had been standing in the cabin doorway, listening. He came out now, his face grim. That's how it starts. First the friendly offer, then the legal pressure. Percy Aldrich has been doing this for 10 years, buying up properties from people who can't afford to fight him. "Let him try," Dalton said. "He won't just try. He'll file claim disputes, dig up old boundary disagreements, find some environmental regulation you're violating. He has lawyers on retainer and patience measured in years. Most people eventually sell just to stop the bleeding." Iris joined them, her laptop open. "I've been researching Percy Aldrich. His great-grandfather was Horace Aldrich, Virgil Crane's partner who sold out to the railroad." The three of them looked at each other as that information settled. "So, this is generational," Dalton said. "This is unfinished business," Iris corrected. "Horace Aldrich helped the railroad steal water rights in 1907. Now his descendant is trying to control water access in 2025. Same family, same strategy, just a longer timeline." Sutton picked up Virgil's letter, reading it again. "The water belongs to those who stay and build." Virgil Crane knew this would happen. He knew someone like Horace, like Percy, would still be trying to profit off other people's need. That night, Dalton sat at the edge of his shaft and thought about the choices ahead. He could sell to Aldrich, take $50,000, and walk away with more than he'd come with. It would be the practical decision, the safe decision. No legal battles, no years of litigation, just money and the freedom to start over somewhere else. But he thought about Beverly Chen's grandparents, homesteading in the 20s, about Trent Ashwood trying to save his family farm, about everyone in Dust Haven who'd stayed when leaving made sense, who'd chosen stubborn hope over practical surrender. He thought about his ex-wife saying she couldn't watch him drown and realized she'd been right. He had been drowning, had been pulled under by failure and debt and the weight of broken dreams. But this wasn't drowning. This was diving with purpose, going down to find something worth bringing back up. Virgil Crane had sealed the well to protect it from people like Horace Aldrich. Bernard Thorne had died trying to open it again. Now Dalton was 80 feet down with 120 to go, and Percy Aldrich thought he could buy what others had died protecting. Wrong, Dalton said to the darkness. He stood up and went back to work, rigging the pulley system for tomorrow's descent. The bottle sat beside Virgil's journals and the surveyor's transit and Bernard's pickaxe, artifacts from people who'd believed something mattered more than money. Dalton was beginning to understand what that something was. It was principle. It was community. It was the stubborn human insistence that some things couldn't be bought, only earned through sweat and determination, and the willingness to go down into the dark, believing you'd find light. Tomorrow he'd descend again. Tomorrow he'd dig deeper. And if Percy Aldrich wanted to fight, he'd discover that some people had nothing left to lose, which made them the most dangerous fighters of all. Iris found the document in the county recorder's office on a Tuesday morning, buried in a filing cabinet that predated digital records. She called Dalton immediately, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "I found something. You need to see this." She arrived at the cabin an hour later with a leather portfolio containing photocopies of documents that looked older than the Republic. She spread them on the makeshift table, her hands hovering over the pages like they were sacred texts. "This is the original land grant for your property," she said. "Filed in 1891 by Virgil Crane. Look at the water rights clause." Dalton read the faded text, said water rights appurtenant to property shall remain in perpetuity with the landholder, regardless of subsequent claims or filings, as established by prior beneficial use and first appropriation. What does that mean in regular language? It means the water legally belongs to whoever owns this cabin, not to surrounding properties, not to regional authorities, not to developers. To you. Iris pulled out more documents. I cross-referenced this with Percy Aldrich's property acquisitions. He's been buying up every parcel around yours, probably thinking he could claim the water through majority land ownership. But this grant supersedes everything. If you reach the well, the water is yours to control. Sutton arrived with lunch and news that complicated things further. Percy Aldrich filed a complaint with the county this morning. Says your excavation violates safety codes and threatens groundwater contamination. There's going to be a hearing next week. Can he do that? He can try. Whether it holds up is another question. Sutton unwrapped sandwiches with the care of someone buying time to think. But here's the thing, he's not wrong about the safety codes. What you're doing is technically illegal, without proper permits, inspections, and engineering oversight. You're one complaint away from a stop work order. Dalton looked at his shaft, now 95 feet deep. He was more than halfway to the sealed chamber. How long would permits take? 6 months if you're lucky. A year more likely. Sutton met his eyes. And that's assuming they're approved at all. Aldrich sits on the county planning board. He could delay this indefinitely. That evening, Dalton called a meeting at Sutton's hardware store. The same people who'd visited his excavation site came, plus others who'd heard about the discovery. They filled the small store, standing shoulder to shoulder among the shelves of nails and rope and forgotten tools. "Percy Aldrich is trying to stop the excavation," Dalton said without preamble. "He's using safety regulations and legal challenges. If we let him, this well stays sealed and nothing changes. What are you proposing?" Beverly Chen asked. "I keep digging. I reach the well before his hearing, before his lawyers can file injunctions. And when I find water, we establish a community cooperative. Everyone who's been holding on to their land, everyone who stayed when leaving made sense. You all get equal shares in the water rights." "That's not how water rights work," someone objected. "It's not how they usually work," Iris corrected. "But the original land grant gives Dalton complete control. If he chooses to create a cooperative and distribute rights equally, that's legal. Unusual, but legal. Why would you do that?" Trent Ashwood asked. "That water could make you rich." Dalton thought about the question. A month ago, maybe even a week ago, he might have wanted that. But somewhere in the descent, somewhere between Bernard Thorne's pickaxe and Virgil Crane's letter, his motivation had shifted because Virgil Crane sealed that well to protect it from people who saw profit instead of community. "I'm not going to be the person who proves him wrong." He looked around at the weathered faces, the work-hardened hands, the stubborn hope in tired eyes. This town stayed when the water left. You all deserve to be here when it comes back. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sutton spoke. I'm 3 months behind on my store loan. The bank's been patient, but patience has limits. If Percy finds out, he'll buy the loan and foreclose. I need you to know that before you count on me. It cost him something to admit that. Dalton could see it in the way Sutton's jaw tightened, in the way he looked at the floor instead of meeting anyone's eyes. I'm not much better, Beverly Chen said. My property taxes are overdue. Percy's already approached me twice with offers. If he pushes hard enough, I'll have to sell. Others shared similar stories. Debt, foreclosure, pressure from Aldrich's representatives. Each person was one crisis away from losing everything, and Percy knew it. He'd been positioning himself for years, waiting for the moment when he could sweep in and take control of the entire region. That's why this matters, Dalton said. Not just the water, but what we do with it. If we let Aldrich win, this town dies and he builds something else in its place. Something that doesn't include any of you. So what do we do? Trent asked. I keep digging. You keep holding on. And we beat Aldrich to the water. The meeting broke up with handshakes and worried glances. People left in pairs and small groups, talking in low voices about hope and risk, and the thin line between the two. Iris stayed behind with Sutton and Dalton. She had more documents spread across the counter, building a picture that grew darker with each revelation. Percy Aldrich's development company is called Southwest Regional Holdings, she said. They specialize in resort communities and retirement destinations. Look at their other projects. She showed them photographs of pristine golf courses, luxury condominiums, and planned communities with names like Desert Oasis and Sunset Vista. Every one of them had been built on land that used to be farms or small towns. He's done this before, Sutton said, 6 times in 3 states. The pattern is always the same. Buy up distressed properties, wait for the remaining holdouts to fail, then develop the entire region as a unified project. Dust Haven would become Silver Springs or Canyon Heights or some other name that sounds expensive and vaguely southwestern. What happens to the people who live here now? They get bought out at market rates, which in a dying town means next to nothing. Then they leave. Iris closed her laptop. Percy Aldrich isn't just a developer. He's a predator who specializes in dying communities. Dalton looked at the surveyor's transit, sitting among the historical documents. Virgil Crane had used it to establish boundaries, to create legal records that would protect the community he was building. Now, more than a century later, those same boundaries were under attack by the descendant of the man who'd betrayed him. Horace Aldrich sold out his partner in 1907, Dalton said. Percy's trying to finish what his great-grandfather started. Generational theft, Iris agreed. The railroad couldn't take the water by force, so they used legal manipulation. Now Percy's using economic pressure to achieve the same goal. Control the water, control the region. Sutton picked up Virgil's letter, reading it again. The water belongs to those who stay and build. Virgil knew this would happen. He sealed the well and left instructions because he believed someday someone would come along who'd value community over profit. Or he hoped someone would, Iris said. Hope and belief aren't always the same thing. That night, Dalton worked by floodlight, unwilling to lose even the hours darkness normally claimed. He was 105 feet down now, working through a clay layer that yielded grudgingly to his shovel. Every foot deeper felt like a victory against Percy Aldrich, against time, against the weight of history repeating itself. His body had adapted to the work. The blisters had become calluses. The burning shoulders had become lean muscle. He'd lost weight he didn't need and gained strength he hadn't known he was capable of. The shaft had transformed him the way difficult work transforms anyone who commits to it completely. At 110 feet, he found more evidence of Bernard Thorne's attempt: rotted rope, broken tools, and a leather glove that still held the shape of the hand that had worn it. Dalton left them in place, like archaeological evidence, marking the depth where the previous attempt had failed. He wouldn't fail, couldn't fail. Too many people were counting on him now, their hope measured in water rights and cooperative agreements and the stubborn refusal to let Percy Aldrich win. Above, Iris and Sutton took shifts watching, ready to pull him up if something went wrong. They'd become a team bound by shared purpose and the understanding that some battles mattered more than the people fighting them. Dalton dug through the night, his headlamp cutting a small circle of light through the darkness. 95 feet to go, then 90, then 85. Each foot was earned through sweat and determination and the growing certainty that this was what he'd been meant to do all along, not commercial construction consulting, not profit margins and quarterly reports, but this, honest work toward a goal that mattered, building something that would last beyond his lifetime, fighting for people who'd stayed when leaving made sense. The desert sky turned grey with approaching dawn. Dalton climbed out to rest and found Iris asleep in her jeep and Sutton dozing in a camping chair, both of them maintaining their vigil. He stood there looking at them, at the shaft that descended into darkness, at the cabin that had cost him $300 and everything he'd been running from. He'd come here to hide. He'd found purpose instead. And now, with 75 feet left to dig, and Percy Aldrich mobilizing lawyers and county officials, the real test was just beginning. Tomorrow, the hearing. Tomorrow, the legal challenges. Tomorrow, the fight for whether water belonged to communities or corporations. But tonight, for these few hours before dawn, Dalton allowed himself to believe they'd win. He had to. Hope was all any of them had left. Dalton discovered the false bottom purely by accident. He'd been reviewing Virgil's journals for the 100th time, looking for any detail about the mechanical seal he might have missed. When the metal box slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a sound that was wrong, too hollow, and too light, he picked it up and examined it more carefully. The interior dimensions didn't match the exterior. There was space unaccounted for, maybe 2 inches deep. He ran his fingers along the seams and found a catch so cleverly hidden that only someone looking for it would notice. The false bottom released with a click. Inside were more pages, folded tight and protected by oilcloth that had kept them pristine. Dalton's hands shook as he unfolded them. The handwriting was Virgil's, but these entries had never been meant for the main journals. These were private, written in anger and pain. June 1907, the first page began. I know now the full depth of Horace's betrayal. It was not impulse or weakness that made him sell our secrets to the railroad. It was planned from the beginning. Dalton read faster, his breath catching as the truth unfolded. Horace Aldrich had been the railroad's agent all along. He'd befriended Virgil specifically to learn about the water source. He'd invested in the homestead not to build, but to gain access to their discoveries. Every piece of surveying data, every drilling log, every measurement, Horace had passed it all to the railroad while pretending to be a partner. But his betrayal went deeper still, Virgil wrote. I have obtained copies of the surveying documents filed with the territorial government. Horace deliberately falsified boundary markers. He moved property lines, altered coordinates, and created conflicting claims that would take years to resolve in court. By the time any homesteader could prove the fraud, they would be bankrupt from legal fees. The pages included detailed comparisons, Horace's official surveys versus the actual measurements Virgil had taken with his transit. The discrepancies were intentional and systematic. Horace Aldrich hadn't just betrayed his partner. He'd rigged the entire legal framework to ensure the railroad would win. The judge who ruled against us was Horace's cousin, another page revealed. The surveyor who validated the false boundaries was paid by the railroad. The lawyer who represented the homesteaders was incompetent by design. Horace recommended him, knowing he would fail. Every piece was positioned years in advance. Dalton felt sick. This wasn't just historical injustice. This was a blueprint for exactly what Percy Aldrich was doing now. He called Iris immediately. She arrived within the hour, and when she read the hidden pages, her face went pale. This changes everything, she said. These surveying errors weren't mistakes. They were fraud. And if Horace's false surveys were used to establish property boundaries that are still in use today, Then every land title in this region could be invalid, Dalton finished. They spread maps across the table, modern property lines compared to Virgil's accurate surveys. The discrepancies were everywhere. Boundaries that didn't align, sections that overlapped, coordinates that placed landmarks in impossible locations. Horace Aldrich's fraud had infected the legal foundation of the entire valley. This is why Percy has been so aggressive about buying properties, Iris said. He knows. He has to know. If anyone discovers the surveying fraud, decades of property transfers could be challenged. But if he owns everything, controls everything, then it doesn't matter. He can simply resurvey under his ownership and establish new legal boundaries. And anyone who doesn't sell gets caught in legal limbo when the truth comes out. Their titles become questionable, their loans get called, their insurance gets cancelled. They're forced to sell to the only buyer who can afford to wait out the legal mess, Percy Aldrich. Sutton arrived as they were piecing it together. When he read the hidden pages, he sat down heavily, his face grey. "My store's title," he said quietly. "I had it surveyed 2 years ago for a refinancing. The surveyor found inconsistencies, but said they were within acceptable margins of error. I didn't think anything of it, because you trusted the original surveys," Iris said. "Everyone did. But those surveys were fraudulent from the start." Dalton looked at the pages spread before them, evidence that could unravel more than a century of property law. "Percy knows about this. He has to. That's why he's been so methodical, so patient. He's not just buying properties. He's buying silence. Every person who sells to him becomes complicit in maintaining the fraud. And anyone who fights him gets destroyed by the truth when it comes out. The titles are questionable, the boundaries are wrong, and the legal fees to sort it out would bankrupt anyone who tried." Sutton looked at Dalton. "He approached me last week, offered to buy my store for 3 times what it's worth. I thought he was being generous. Now I understand. He was buying my silence about the survey inconsistencies." Iris was already on her laptop, cross-referencing documents. "Percy filed boundary disputes on 12 properties in the past 6 months. All of them near your land, Dalton. He's been systematically challenging surveys, creating legal uncertainty, then offering to buy properties at premium prices to resolve the disputes. The people who sell think they're getting a good deal. The people who don't sell find themselves in legal nightmares. What about the county? The state? Someone must have noticed the surveying fraud. Horace Aldrich's false surveys have been on record for over a century. They're the foundation that every subsequent survey has been based on. Challenging them means challenging the entire legal structure of property ownership in this valley. No one wants to open that can of worms?" Iris looked up from her screen. "Except Percy Aldrich already has. He's been quietly filing corrections and amendments, repositioning boundaries under the guise of updating old records. In another 5 years, he'll own enough property to completely resurvey the entire region under his authority, establishing new boundaries that favor his holdings. Generational theft," Dalton said. "Horace started it. Percy's finishing it." They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them. This was bigger than a well, bigger than water rights. This was systematic fraud that had shaped a century of property ownership. And Percy Aldrich was using his knowledge of that fraud to complete his great-grandfather's work. "We have to expose this," Iris said. "If we do, we throw every property title in the valley into question," Sutton countered. "People who've owned their land for generations would suddenly have uncertain claims. Banks would freeze loans. Insurance companies would cancel policies. We'd destroy the community trying to save it, but if we don't, Percy wins. He buys everything, resurveys on his terms, and the fraud gets buried forever under his ownership." Dalton picked up the hidden pages, thinking about Virgil Crane hiding this truth in a false bottom, protecting it but also concealing it. Had Virgil struggled with the same choice? Expose the fraud and destroy innocent people's security, or hide it and let the guilty win? "There's another option," he said slowly. "We reach the well first. We establish the water cooperative based on Virgil's original accurate surveys. We create new property documentation using the correct boundaries, and we do it as part of the cooperative agreements. Anyone who joins the cooperative gets their title corrected as part of the membership process. That's ambitious, Iris said. That's desperate, Sutton corrected. You're talking about creating a parallel legal structure based on century-old surveys that contradict official records. I'm talking about using the truth to fix what fraud broke. Dalton looked at them both. Virgil sealed the well and hid this evidence because he knew someday someone would need both. The water and the truth together. That's the only way this works. Percy won't let us, Sutton said. The hearing is in 3 days. He'll shut down your excavation, tie you up in legal challenges, and buy out everyone who can't afford to wait. Then we don't wait. Dalton stood up. I'm at 110 feet. 90 to go. I can reach the seal in 72 hours if I work straight through. That's not safe. Nothing about this is safe. Not the excavation, not the legal battle, not the choice between exposure and silence. He looked at Virgil's hidden pages. But Virgil Crane did the dangerous thing. He documented the truth even knowing it could destroy as much as it saved. The least I can do is finish what he started. Iris gathered up the documents carefully. I'll digitize everything, create multiple backups, and file the evidence with state archives. If anything happens, the truth will be preserved, and I'll start talking to people, Sutton said. Quiet conversations about the cooperative, about corrected surveys, about choosing to join something rather than being forced to sell. If enough people understand what's really happening, Percy loses his leverage. They worked through the night, each pursuing their part of the plan. Iris documented and cross-referenced, building an irrefutable case. Sutton made phone calls and visits, spreading the word carefully, and Dalton descended back into his shaft, working with renewed urgency. At 120 feet, his shovel struck stone that sang differently when he hit it. He cleared around it and found carved marks, surveyor's notations, preserved in limestone. Virgil had marked the depth, establishing a permanent record that no false document could erase. Dalton traced the numbers with his fingers and understood. Everything Virgil had done, the journals, the maps, the hidden pages, the surveyor's marks deep underground, had been about creating truth that would outlast lies. Documentation that couldn't be altered, evidence that couldn't be destroyed, hope buried deep enough to survive a century of fraud. Now it was Dalton's turn to bring it back to the surface. Not just water, but justice. Not just survival, but vindication for everyone who'd stayed, who'd believed, who'd refused to let Percy Aldrich's version of the future erase Virgil Crane's vision of the past. 70 feet to go. 3 days until the hearing. And somewhere down in the dark, beneath layers of earth and time and systematic betrayal, was water that belonged to honest folk who'd stayed and built. Dalton climbed out as dawn broke, his body exhausted but his purpose clear. The hidden pages sat beside Virgil's journals, no longer concealed but not yet revealed. The timing would matter. Everything would matter. We're going to win this, he said to Iris and Sutton. Believing it, because the alternative was unthinkable. They looked at him, these two people who'd become his partners in purpose, and nodded. Not because victory was certain, but because some fights mattered enough to risk everything. The excavation continued. The truth waited to be used. And Percy Aldrich, somewhere in his clean SUV with his pressed khakis and his generational theft, had no idea that the past he thought he'd buried was about to rise up and destroy him. Iris made the discovery at 2 a.m. in the state archives, her eyes burning from hours of searching through digitized records. She called Dalton immediately, not caring about the hour. I found it. The original field notes. Horace Aldrich's actual surveying records from 1907. Dalton climbed out of the shaft. He was at 140 feet now, working around the clock, and took her call on speaker so Sutton could hear. The state requires surveyors to keep field notes separate from official filings, Iris explained, her voice electric with exhaustion and triumph. Horace filed false surveys with the county, but his field notes show the real measurements. He documented his own fraud, probably as insurance in case he needed leverage later. The notes are preserved in the state archives as historical records. Can we use them in court? Sutton asked. Better than that. They prove deliberate fraud. Not errors, not mistakes, intentional falsification with documentation of the real boundaries. Combined with Virgil's surveys, we have irrefutable proof that every property title in this valley has been based on false information for over a century. Dalton felt the weight of that truth. If we reveal this, we create chaos, or we create opportunity. Iris's tone shifted. I've been drafting cooperative agreements all night. If property owners join the water cooperative and accept corrected boundaries based on the true surveys, they get clear titles, water rights, and protection from Percy's legal challenges. It's voluntary reformation rather than forced litigation. Percy will fight it. Let him. We have the evidence. He has a legacy of fraud. Iris paused. But we need the well, Dalton. Without water, the cooperative is just paperwork. With water, it's survival. The temporary restraining order arrived at dawn, delivered by a deputy who looked apologetic. Dalton had to cease all excavation, immediately pending the county hearing, now scheduled for the following morning. Violations would result in fines and possible criminal charges. How far down are you? The deputy asked quietly. 140 feet. How far to go? 60. The deputy looked at the paperwork in his hand, then at the shaft. I'm required to inform you of the order. I'm also required to verify compliance. I'll be back in 24 hours to verify. He met Dalton's eyes. What you do in the next 24 hours is between you and your conscience. After he left, Sutton brought news that was both good and terrible. 17 families have signed preliminary cooperative agreements. They're willing to risk the title corrections if we can deliver water. But Percy has made counteroffers to 12 of them, double what their properties are worth, with immediate payment. 3 have already accepted. Why would they take his offer if the cooperative gives them water? Because Percy's money is real and immediate. Your water is 60 feet away and might not exist. Sutton's voice was heavy. And because Percy found out about Beverly Chen's tax debt, he paid it off for her, then offered to buy her property for twice its value. She's signing this afternoon. Dalton felt something crack inside him. Beverly Chen, whose grandparents had homesteaded here in the 20s, who'd been at that first meeting with hope in her eyes. Fear beats hope every time, Sutton said quietly. Percy knows that. He's been using it for years, but that afternoon Beverly Chen showed up at the excavation site. She looked older than she had a week ago, worn down by choices she didn't want to make. I came to explain, she said. Percy paid my tax debt. $18,000 I didn't have. He says if I sell, I can finally stop worrying, finally rest. My children want me to take the offer. I understand, Dalton said. And he did. But I need you to understand something too. Beverly looked at the shaft, at the equipment, at the evidence of weeks of brutal work. My grandparents lost everything in the Dust Bowl. Came here in 1925 with nothing and built a life because Dust Haven had people who helped each other survive. When my grandmother died, she made me promise to stay, to hold the land for the family that would come after. She pulled papers from her purse, not sale documents, but cooperative agreements. Percy's money would let me rest. But I've been resting for 20 years while this town died around me. If you find water, Mr. Harper, I want to be here to see it. And if you don't, well, at least I tried something before the end. She signed the agreements and left, and Dalton stood there with tears he didn't bother to hide. Sutton gripped his shoulder, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. That night, they gathered everyone who'd signed cooperative agreements, 19 families now, each one choosing risk over certainty. Dalton showed them Virgil's hidden pages, explained the surveying fraud, and laid out exactly what they were fighting for. Percy Aldrich is completing what his great-grandfather started, he said. Control through corruption, profit through fraud. If we let him win, this valley becomes whatever he wants it to be, and none of you will be part of it. And if we fight, Trent Ashwood asked, then we need water in the next 24 hours, and we need to be willing to face every legal challenge Percy throws at us. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But it will be ours. They voted. 19 families, 19 votes, 19 choices for stubborn hope over comfortable surrender. Dalton descended into the shaft at midnight. 60 feet to go and 24 hours to do it. Impossible mathematics. But he'd come to understand that impossible was just another word for necessary. Iris had installed additional lighting and a better pulley system. Sutton had recruited volunteers to work in shifts, hauling dirt and installing supports. The community that had been dying alone was now fighting together, and there was power in that. At 150 feet, Dalton found more of Bernard Thorne's equipment, a broken headlamp, work gloves, a thermos that still smelled faintly of coffee. The artifacts of a man who died trying, left in place like waymarkers on a path toward hope or tragedy. Dalton worked through the night, his body moving beyond exhaustion into something else, a state of pure will where pain became information and fatigue became fuel. Above, he could hear voices, community members taking turns on watch, making sure he wasn't alone in the dark. At 160 feet, the rock changed. The sandstone gave way to limestone, and the sound of his pickaxe rang differently, more hollow. Water had carved this stone once, had shaped it over millennia. Somewhere below, that water waited, 20 feet to go. Dalton climbed up at dawn to find 30 people gathered around his shaft. They'd brought food, coffee, tools, and something more valuable than any of it. They'd brought belief. Not certainty, but the choice to believe anyway, which was the only kind of faith that mattered. "We're with you," Trent said simply. "Whatever happens at the hearing tomorrow, we're with you." Dalton looked at their faces, weathered, worried, but determined. This was what Virgil Crane had sealed the well for. Not for the water itself, but for people willing to fight for it together. He went back down. 20 feet to salvation or failure. 20 feet to vindication or loss. 20 feet to water that would either save them all or prove that some things stayed buried no matter how deep you dug. The hearing was tomorrow. The restraining order was active. Percy Aldrich was mobilizing lawyers and county officials. But tonight, in the dark at 160 feet below the desert, Dalton Harper was digging toward truth, with a community standing guard above him. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it had to be. At 175 feet, Dalton's pickaxe struck something that wasn't stone. He stopped, his breath loud in the confined space. The headlamp beam caught metal, smooth, deliberate, placed there by human hands. He cleared around it carefully, his blistered fingers gentle despite their roughness. The mechanical seal, Virgil Crane's final protection. It was more sophisticated than Dalton had imagined. Bronze gears interlocked with stone, creating a plug that sealed the chamber below. Water stains marked the edges where moisture had seeped through over decades. But the mechanism itself looked intact. He pulled himself up 15 feet to where his tools were staged and found Virgil's letter, reading the technical details by headlamp. The seal required a specific sequence. 3 gears turned in precise order, each rotation calculated to release pressure gradually rather than all at once. But there was something else. A keyhole positioned at the center of the mechanism. Dalton searched his memory of the artifacts they'd found. The journals, the maps, the transit, the hidden pages. Nothing had mentioned a key. He climbed out, his body protesting every movement after 18 hours of continuous work. "I found the seal," he told Iris and Sutton. "But it needs a key." Dawn was breaking, painting the desert in shades Dalton had learned to measure time by. The hearing was in 6 hours. They'd run out of time. Iris went through every document again, searching for any reference to a key. Sutton examined the artifacts themselves, looking for something they'd missed. Dalton sat at the edge of the shaft, exhausted and defeated. Then he saw it. Bernard Thorne's pickaxe, lying where Sutton had placed it weeks ago. Dalton picked it up, looking at the carved initials, and noticed something he'd missed before. The carving went deeper than initials. There was something wedged into the wood beneath them. He worked it free carefully. A chain, tarnished nearly black. And hanging from it, a bronze key. "Bernard found it," Dalton said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached the seal, found the key, but the shaft collapsed before he could use it. The 3 of them stood there, understanding what that meant. Bernard Thorne had died with success 20 feet away, the key to everything around his neck when the walls came down. "Finish it," Sutton said, his voice rough. "Finish what Bernard started." Dalton descended for the last time, the key chain around his own neck. At 175 feet, he positioned himself in front of the seal and examined the mechanism by headlamp. 3 gears, each marked with surveyor's notations. He turned them in the sequence Virgil had documented, feeling resistance, then release. Then resistance again. The final gear required the key. He inserted it, and the metal fit perfectly, sliding into place like it had been waiting a century for this moment. He turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism respond. Gears engaging deep within stone. There was a sound like a sigh. Pressure releasing, and the seal began to open. Water appeared first as moisture, darkening the stone around the seal's edges. Then as seepage, small streams finding paths through bronze and rock. Then as flow, cold and clear and unstoppable. Dalton positioned the collection system he'd built, pipes that would channel the water up while preventing the shaft from flooding. The engineering was crude but functional, cobbled together from hardware store supplies and desperation. Above, he heard shouting. The water was reaching the surface. He started to climb, but the shaft trembled. A support beam cracked, the sound like a gunshot in the confined space. Sand and small stones began to fall. The walls were collapsing. Dalton moved faster, climbing the supports he'd installed, racing the failure that was spreading from below. Another beam cracked. The shaft walls, undermined by released water pressure, were giving way. At 100 feet, a section collapsed behind him, the sound deafening. At 75 feet, he could see daylight above. At 50 feet, hands reached down Sutton, Trent, others, grabbing his arms and hauling him up as the shaft below pancaked in on itself. They pulled him out and rolled away from the edge as the entire excavation collapsed inward. 2 months of work disappearing in seconds of thunder and dust. Dalton lay on the desert sand, gasping, waiting for the devastation to register. Then he heard it. Water, flowing through the pipes he'd installed. Cold and clear and real, pouring out onto the desert sand for the first time in 118 years. People were crying, laughing, touching the water like it was sacred. Sutton knelt beside the flow, his weathered hands cupped to catch it, his face transformed by something that looked like prayer. Iris was already taking measurements, documenting flow rates, but her scientific precision couldn't hide the tears running down her dusty face. Beverly Chen stood at the edge of the group, her hand over her mouth, watching water return to land her grandparents had loved. Dalton sat up slowly, his body beyond exhaustion, and watched his community, because that's what they'd become, gather around water that belonged to them. The key hung around his neck, its purpose fulfilled. Bernard Thorne's sacrifice validated, Virgil Crane's faith proven, and somewhere in the collapsed shaft below, the mechanical seal stood open, delivering water that would save them all. The hearing was in 4 hours. Percy Aldrich was waiting with lawyers and county officials. But none of that mattered anymore. The water had returned. Everything else was just paperwork. The county hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Percy Aldrich sat at the front with 3 lawyers, their briefcases arranged like artillery. Dalton sat across from them, flanked by Iris and Sutton, wearing clothes still dusty from the collapse. The county commissioner, a woman named Judith Vance, looked tired before the hearing even began. She'd probably expected a routine safety violation case. Instead, she faced a room full of people who looked ready to riot if the decision went wrong. Mr. Aldrich's complaint alleges unsafe excavation practices and potential groundwater contamination. Commissioner Vance began. "Mr. Harper, you were served with a cease and desist order yesterday. Can you confirm you've complied?" "The excavation is complete," Dalton said. "The shaft collapsed this morning. There's nothing left to cease." Percy's lead lawyer stood immediately. "Commissioner, this admission of willful violation of a restraining order, the order required me to stop digging. I stopped. The collapse was a consequence of reaching the water source, not defiance of legal authority. You reached water." Commissioner Vance leaned forward, Show her, Sutton said. Iris opened her laptop and displayed photographs taken 2 hours earlier. Water flowing from pipes, people filling containers, gardens being irrigated. The images told a story that no legal argument could refute. This water is from the historical well documented in territorial records from 1891, Iris explained. The same well that was sealed to protect it from illegal seizure by railroad interests. Mr. Harper has successfully reopened a legitimate water source on property he legally owns, Percy's lawyer recovered quickly. The property boundaries are in dispute. Our surveys show your surveys are based on fraudulent data from 1907. Iris pulled up documents on the screen. These are the original field notes of Horace Aldrich, Mr. Percy Aldrich's great-grandfather. They show deliberate falsification of boundary markers and coordinates. The fraud has been documented in state archives for over a century. The hearing room went silent. Percy's face had gone carefully blank, but his hands gripped the table edge. Furthermore, Iris continued, we have surveyor's records from Virgil Crane using a period-appropriate Gurley transit, showing the accurate boundaries. Mr. Harper's property deed, based on the original territorial grant, predates the fraudulent surveys and supersedes them. Commissioner Vance looked at Percy. Mr. Aldrich, did you know about these surveying discrepancies? Historical irregularities in century-old surveys are common. Did you know? Her voice was steel. Percy's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Percy stood, smoothing his polo shirt. I've been aware that some historical surveys contained errors. My company has been working to correct them through proper channels, by buying up properties and resurveying under your ownership, Dalton said. Completing what your great-grandfather started, controlling the valley's water and land through legal manipulation. That's slander. It's documented fact. Iris displayed more evidence. Horace Aldrich partnered with Virgil Crane specifically to learn about the water source, then sold that information to railroad interests. He falsified surveys to create conflicting claims that bankrupted homesteaders through legal fees. Now, over a century later, Percy Aldrich has been using knowledge of that fraud to systematically acquire properties at distressed prices. Beverly Chen stood up in the gallery. He paid my tax debt, then offered to buy my land. I thought he was being generous. Now, I understand he was buying my silence about survey problems he knew existed. Others spoke up, telling similar stories. Each one added weight to the pattern Iris had documented. Commissioner Vance held up her hand for silence. Mr. Aldrich, I'm ordering a full investigation into your company's land acquisitions in this county. This hearing is continued pending that investigation. She looked at Dalton. As for the well, if you can demonstrate safe water management and proper distribution, I see no reason to interfere with a historical water source on legally owned property. We've established a community cooperative, Dalton said. 19 families have already signed agreements for shared water rights based on corrected property boundaries. Everyone who wants to participate can, and those who don't, keep their current boundaries and can buy water from the cooperative at cost. No one is forced to do anything. Percy gathered his lawyers and left without another word, his clean SUV pulling away from the hearing room like a retreat. Through the windows, Dalton could see the man who'd seemed so powerful, reduced to someone who'd lost the only battle that mattered. Outside, the community gathered around Dalton, Iris, and Sutton. There was no celebration, just quiet satisfaction and the understanding that the real work was just beginning. We need to formalize the cooperative, Iris said. Get proper legal structure, establish water management protocols, complete the corrected surveys. We need to build infrastructure, Trent added. Pipes, storage, distribution systems. The water's flowing, but we need to get it where it's needed, and we need to help the families Percy was pressuring, Beverly said. Some of them are in real financial trouble. If we don't help, they'll still have to sell, cooperative or not. Dalton listened to them plan, these people who'd chosen risk over surrender. They didn't need him to lead anymore. They needed him to work alongside them, which was all he'd ever really wanted. The water flowed at his cabin, cold and clear and unstoppable. Virgil Crane's mechanical seal had worked perfectly. Bernard Thorne's sacrifice had meaning. And somewhere in the collapsed shaft, deep underground, was evidence that some things built right lasted forever. They had water. They had truth. They had community. Percy Aldrich had money and lawyers and generational ambition, but he'd learned what his great-grandfather had never accepted. Some things couldn't be bought, only earned through sweat and determination and the willingness to dig deeper than seemed possible. The desert would green again. Dust Haven would survive, and Dalton Harper, who'd come here with $300 and nothing left to lose, had found something worth more than anything he'd left behind. He'd found purpose. He'd found people. He'd found water in the wasteland and hope in the darkness, and that, finally, was enough. 3 months after the well opened, Dalton stood in front of his rebuilt cabin and watched the desert remember how to be green. It started small. Patches of grass around the water distribution points, stubborn wildflowers that appeared overnight like they'd been waiting underground for their chance. Then larger changes. Trees that had looked dead for decades suddenly budded. The air smelled different, carried moisture that hadn't existed before. The cabin itself had been transformed through community effort. Sutton had led the reconstruction, teaching Dalton proper building techniques while others contributed labor and materials. The tin roof no longer rattled. The walls no longer leaked sand. It was solid, permanent, built to last the way Virgil Crane had built things. Inside, on a shelf he'd built himself, sat the artifacts that had made this possible. Virgil's journals in their leather bindings, the surveyor's transit polished and preserved, the mechanical seal's bronze key on its chain, and beside them a new journal, Dalton's own, documenting the cooperative's establishment and growth. He'd started writing the day after the hearing, following Virgil's example. Not for himself, but for whoever came after. Whoever might need to know that broken things could be fixed and sealed, things could be opened if you had enough determination and people willing to help. The cooperative now had 32 member families. More joined each week as word spread and people understood they had an alternative to selling to developers. Iris had mapped corrected boundaries for every property, using Virgil's surveys and modern technology to create legal documentation that would stand up in any court. Percy Aldrich had withdrawn from the county entirely. The investigation Commissioner Vance ordered had revealed enough questionable practices that his development company faced lawsuits in 3 states. The last Dalton heard, Percy was selling off properties and settling claims. The generational empire, his great-grandfather, started crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Sutton's hardware store was thriving. The cooperative members needed supplies, equipment, materials for building the infrastructure that would carry water throughout the valley. He'd hired 2 employees and expanded his inventory. Some mornings Dalton would find him standing in his doorway with coffee, looking at his store like he was seeing it for the first time. "Never thought I'd make it to retirement," Sutton had said once. "Now I'm thinking about what comes after." Iris had accepted a position at a regional university but kept her home in Dust Haven. Her research on the aquifer system and the community cooperative model was being published in journals that mattered. Universities were calling, wanting her to present. She'd rebuilt her reputation on her own terms, with work nobody could steal because everyone knew whose it was. Beverly Chen had planted a garden. Real vegetables, not the dusty hope of previous years. She'd invited Dalton over to see the first tomatoes, red and impossible in the desert sun. And they'd stood there together not saying much because the tomatoes said everything that needed saying. Trent Ashwood's farm was producing again. Other farms were coming back to life. The grocery store in Dust Haven had reopened. A young couple had bought the closed diner and served food that people actually wanted to eat. Small changes, but they accumulated into something larger, a community that was growing instead of dying. Dalton's phone rang. He almost didn't recognize the number, then realized he did. He answered carefully. "Hello, Dalton," his ex-wife's voice, cautious but not cold. "I heard about what you did. About the well and the cooperative. It was in the state newspaper. It wasn't just me, he said, which was true. But you started it. You finished it. She paused. The Dalton I divorced would have sold that land to the developer for whatever he could get. I'm trying to understand what changed. Dalton looked at the green spreading across his land, at the cabin that had become a home, at the community that had become his purpose. I stopped running, he said. I found something worth staying for. They talked for 20 minutes. Not about reconciliation. That ship had sailed and they both knew it. But about closure, about understanding, about the possibility that failure wasn't permanent if you were willing to dig deep enough to find what came after. When he hung up, Dalton felt lighter than he had in years. Not because she'd called, but because he'd been able to talk to her as someone who'd built something instead of someone who'd lost everything. The difference mattered. That evening, the cooperative held its first official meeting in Sutton's store. They discussed water distribution schedules, infrastructure maintenance, and long-term planning. Dalton took notes, documenting decisions the way Virgil had documented his. After the meeting, people lingered. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Community wasn't just shared resources. It was shared time, shared stories, shared belief in something bigger than individual survival. Dalton walked back to his cabin, under stars that seemed brighter than they had 3 months ago. The desert night was still cool, still vast, but it no longer felt empty. Water gurgled through pipes he'd helped install. Generators hummed at distribution points. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing music. He sat on his porch, actual porch with actual chairs, and opened his journal. He wrote about the day, about the meeting, about the conversation with his ex-wife. Then he wrote something Virgil Crane might have written, a message for whoever found this journal decades or centuries from now. The water still flows. The community still stands. And I learned that a man's worth isn't measured by what he's lost, but by what he's willing to dig for. Some things stay buried until someone cares enough to bring them back to light. Be that person. The world needs people who dig. He closed the journal and set it beside Virgil's, 2 records of the same truth told a century apart. Then he sat in the dark and listened to water he'd found, serving people he'd come to love, in a place he'd chosen to stay. The desert wind moved through new leaves on recovering trees. The tin roof no longer rattled, it was solid now, permanent. And somewhere deep underground, in a chamber that had waited more than a century, Virgil Crane's mechanical seal stood open, delivering water that belonged to those who stayed and built. Dalton had come here with $300 and a need to hide. He'd found water, community, and purpose. He'd found redemption measured not in profit but in depth, not in success but in service. He'd found home, and that was worth more than anything he'd left behind, anything he'd lost, or anything he'd feared he'd never find again. The water flowed. The community grew. The desert remembered Green and Dalton Harper, who'd bought a broken cabin for his last $300. Discovered that sometimes the best investments are the ones that seem worthless until you're willing to dig deep enough to find their true value. The story didn't end here, but it began again every day, with water and hope and people choosing to stay. That was enough. That would always be enough.